God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the I Don't Belong Here show, and I am your host, Samantha Beningo. I am a behavioral scientist, a career psychotherapist, a sixth-year PhD candidate in clinical psychology, a master's level psychologist and counselor, and I am here breaking down the Justice for John O'Keefe case. So as I have been going through different clips from the two Karen Read trials to try to put together the sequence of events, everything that occurred on January 29th of 2022 to track the police whereabouts, I once again stumbled upon Hank Brennan's closing arguments. And interestingly, even though that was just a few weeks ago, it feels like it was 1,000 lifetimes ago. And because I have been doing so much digging through the archives, when I hear that closing argument now, it was appalling to me how incorrect, how totally off base, and how much the defense in their case in chief disproved all of the claims of the Commonwealth. So much so that I thought, to help out those who may just stumble upon this case at some point in the future and may be confused that the Commonwealth, for whatever reason, had the story correctly, I thought I would help them out by pulling together all that we know about this case to help those that are still foggy about what happened here or why the Commonwealth failed miserably in their efforts to convict Karen Read. I thought I would put this video together to help clarify things a bit. So we're going to hear, I know how torturous this is, once again, Hank Brennan's closing arguments, only this time in a way that may make a little more sense to you. This is me interrupting your programming to remind you to like this video right now. And don't forget to subscribe. Like this video.
John O'Keefe was 46 years old. 46 years old. He spent his life helping people. He's described as a good man, kind, generous, thoughtful. He was a Boston police officer. He worked to help the community. Everything you've heard about this man, he was a good man. He helped people. When his niece and nephew had nobody, he took them in. He took them in. John O'Keefe seemed to be the type of person who would help anybody at any time. And on January 29th, 2022, John O'Keefe needed some help. He needed help from somebody else. You see, John O'Keefe had just been hit by Karen Read in front of 34 Fairview Road, and he lay on the ground dying.
So let's help out Hank Brennan here with this theory that John O'Keefe, was hit by a car and then lay dying, and that Karen Read left him there knowingly left John there alive, gravely injured, and drove away, which consequently was one of the charges that Karen Read was being presented with, right? So let's hear now from the witnesses that the defense put forth, those who were originally hired by the FBI, not by the defense, and were made available to both sides, the Commonwealth and to the defense evenly, to figure out whether or not John O'Keefe was killed by being hit by a motor vehicle, which was the only task that these two men were asked to figure out by the federal government.
That hand and arm is accelerated. The hand's accelerated up to the speed of the vehicle in about 2 to 4 milliseconds.
How long does it take to blink your eye?
250 milliseconds. It takes a quarter of a second to blink your eye. So this occurs if your hand's hit at 15 miles an hour by a car, it's going to be accelerated up to the speed of the car about 50 times faster than you can blink. So this is lab testing at 17 miles an hour. So the housing and the cover was basically propelled into the forearm of the dummy at 17 miles an hour, almost 300 Gs. So, 300 Gs, if you say the weight of the arm is 10 pounds, 300 Gs means there's 3,000 pounds of force acting on that arm.
Is that enough to break a bone?
It's more than enough to break a bone.
Is that enough to tear ligaments?
Absolutely, yes.
What about the bones in the hand? Are those stronger or the same resistance as the bones in the forearm? Or are they more delicate?
No, the bones in the hand are, as you can imagine, much weaker because they're much smaller. When you look at the carpal bones, the metacarpal bones, the metacarpal interphalangeal joint, which is basically your knuckles, they are much smaller and it takes much less force to fracture your hand bones compared to your ulnar or your radius. That's what it looks like if you have your hand out and it's struck by an SUV. It's all about weight, right? Because you have a 6,000-pound car and you have a 10-pound arm. It's whatever speed that car is going, your arm, your hand, whatever's sticking out there is immediately going to get accelerated up to the speed of that vehicle. It's simple physics. Your center of mass of your body is basically at your umbilicus or your belly button. So in order to move the body, you have to apply a force at that part of the body. If your arm's struck, it's not going to move your body appreciably. All it's going to do, your arm's like a moment arm, it's going to spin you around. Could there be some motion forward or backward if you take a step? Possibly. But the center of mass of your body isn't going to move. You have to get struck by the vehicle to have the body actually move in a specific direction.
If you're talking about only an interaction between the arm and the back of the vehicle, no, there wouldn't be any projection. Again, if you think about this, the arm weighs about, again, with Mr. O'Keefe would be about 11 pounds. So you still have, another 200 plus pounds being held down by gravity, and the force is only acting on the arm. So essentially, the arm would be accelerated, but the whole body, because the center of mass is not being struck, would not be projected.
So this is a slow-mo of the overhead from the real time. It was a GoPro that was recording that real-time video, and this is a slow motion of that video.
I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. As you see the vehicle contact the arm, what happens to the arm as it's being contacted in those milliseconds where it's being accelerated up to 24 miles an hour?
Well, the arm's accelerated up and pushed away from the body. So whatever part of your arm or body is contacting the car, that's going to be pushed forward away from the rest of your body. So not only is it loading the arm with an impact force as it strikes the arm and the hand, but then it's actually stressing the joints too. It's like ripping imagine having a car come and 3,000 pounds of force pulling your arm forward at the elbow, at the shoulder joint. It's putting a lot of force and pressure on that appendage. Now, if Mr. O'Keefe's holding a glass at the time of this impact, think about that. What happens is you're holding a glass. It exposes the knuckles. So if you're holding a glass and your arm's at a 90-degree angle and the car comes back and hits your hand, it's going to strike right on the knuckles. The force is going to be applied right at that joint. And then it's going to likely hit along the forearm back near the elbow.
The debris that comes off of the taillight, the fragments, what speed would they be going at the point of impact when they crack and are released from the taillight?
At the impact speed or less.
In order to penetrate the sweatshirt and cut the arm across, would the shards have to be going faster or slower than the arm?
They would have to be going faster. If they're moving at a common velocity with the arm relative to it, they would somehow have to accelerate with more speed to catch up and go beyond the arm, essentially.
Is that physically possible?
No.
Again, there's thousands of pounds of forces acting on the arm and also on the joint itself, not just the arm or the bones we have to consider and how much force to fracture, but think of the elbow joint and think of the shoulder joint. It takes much less force to dislocate an elbow than it does to actually fracture it. There was no evidence or indication or diagnosis of any dislocations or fractures to the arm at all.
And the taillight material, did you make note of that in this frame?
I did, yes.
What direction is that taillight material going relative to the vehicle?
It's going forward.
And where is the arm?
The arm has been pushed away. Now, you have to remember, as that arm, if it contacts and fractures the taillight, it's not exposed to the fractured pieces that still exist on the taillight itself, because those pieces that fracture haven't gone anywhere because they're against the arm itself. And then as the arm moves away, the pieces then move with the vehicle.
Are the taillight pieces upon fracture moving at the same speed as the arm upon contact?
That's correct, yes.
Is that a matter of physics?
That is a matter of physics, yes.
Is there any possible way for the broken pieces of taillight to out-accelerate the arm upon contact when the arm's being deflected away from the vehicle?
It is not. I don't believe it's physically possible. That was not demonstrated in our testing, and I've never seen that demonstrated in any peer-reviewed articles. Now, you can see here again also the light and the fragments are being propelled forward. So you also have to consider where Mr. O'Keefe was found. He was found in the yard about 10 or 20 feet from the road. There was no exact measurements. But if you look at the motion of the taillight, it's going forward. Now, if Mr. O'Keefe has to move diagonally to the top left of that corner, and if he's not hit with the center of mass, he can't get to where he ends up before the taillight fragments have already gone forward and been deposited on the ground. Average running speed is like 4 to 6 miles an hour. Even if this SUV is going 10 miles an hour, the lights fracture, they're dispersed on the ground, and then Mr. O'Keefe somehow ends up to his point of rest. But you wouldn't find the fragments on him because they've already been pushed forward, come to rest, before he even has a chance to get to where they find him.
Mr. O'Keefe's hat?
Oh,
Did you
that's
look
his
at the
hat.
photograph?
I see now, yes.
Did you know he was wearing a hat that night?
I did, yes.
And did you consider how that hat ended up on the ground in front of 34 Fairview?
No, sir, that was not part of my biomechanical analysis. There's a number of ways a hat can end up in a yard.
Right. Is one of those ways being in a collision with a Lexus?
I suppose that's a possibility, or someone could put it there. I mean, there's a number of different possibilities as to when or how a hat may appear in a yard. This was the final test that was conducted in using a dummy, and it was impacted at 29 miles an hour. And this was a center of mass impact. If we have an auto pedestrian impact, and you want to see where the pedestrian ends up, you have to evaluate how they were impacted by the car. In order to have the pedestrian move any substantial difference, it has to be hit at the center of mass. Again, it has to be hit at that belly button area to propel the body in a certain direction depending on the speed and direction. If there's no center of mass impact, how does someone get to the point of rest? You can't correlate a side swipe where the arm gets contacted and say if someone ends up 20 feet away, there's no way to correlate that arm impact caused them to somehow move 20 feet away. It wouldn't be as a result of the actual incident. It wouldn't be a result of the impact pushing their body in that direction. No, it's not reasonable. That's not physically possible. And you look at the arm itself, and we're looking at talking about the injuries and the abrasions compared to fractures. So if Mr. O'Keefe's arm was hit at 24, 29 miles an hour, what this suggests, and there were only abrasions, what this would suggest is that if the taillight doesn't cover or fracture, you can have your arm hit at 24 miles an hour and you wouldn't have any injuries at all, which from a biomechanical standpoint doesn't make sense. So here's the video showing that strike at 29 miles an hour with the center of mass impact to the dummy. It shows there was extensive damage to the rear of that Lexus. So if you had a center of mass hit, you would have damage to the liftgate, to the fender, to the sheet metal. You would have substantially more damage than what we had in this case.
At 29 miles an hour with a direct impact, did the exemplar taillight exhibit the same type of damage to the diffuser as the subject taillight?
Well, I think there was more in the subject taillight. As I mentioned, I believe the top diffuser
More
on this
damage?
Correct.
Okay.
And secondly, which I believe is just as important, it shows the post-impact trajectory of the dummy. So again, if you're struck on the corner by the Lexus, the dummy goes straight back in line with the vehicle. There's no force and no direction to actually cause that dummy to move off into the side of the vehicle. So you can't be hit center of mass with the vehicle going straight back and somehow end up 10 or 20 feet to the side of where the vehicle is traveling.
So in this circumstance, would you expect the taillight material to be distributed straight back in the same center line as the vehicle is traveling?
Yes, absolutely.
Would you also expect the body to be struck and move in the same center line as the vehicle?
The body's going to move in the direction that the vehicle is moving. That main direction, that main force moving straight back, the body is going to move primarily straight back.
So if you aren't sure why the jurors in this case don't believe there was a car accident, now you have a better idea. Now we have a second issue, though. because the Commonwealth is trying to put forth the idea that John O'Keefe was laying, dying in the snow, and that he must have been there for 6 hours, dying essentially of hypothermia. So this was a diagnosis that the medical examiner, Irene Scortibello, got wrong. She diagnosed that John O'Keefe died from a head injury, but also from hypothermia, misinterpreting whatever evidence that she saw on his body, in his stomach, whatever, misdiagnosing hypothermia, which becomes much more clear to us when we hear from a more experienced medical examiner, maybe the most experienced medical examiner the world has ever seen or known, in Dr. La Posada.
Because we know once he came back and slammed his head, he's not going to get up and move around.
Do you have any training or experience in diagnosing hypothermia in individuals?
Oh, yes.
Have you conducted autopsies of individuals who suffered from or died from hypothermia?
Yes, many.
How many?
100 or more, and then I've supervised my assistants who've also diagnosed the same death from decrease in body temperature.
Have you ever reviewed any peer-reviewed medical literature associated with or discussing hypothermia and something known as Wisniewski spots?
Yes, that's in the medical literature and also in our forensic textbooks.
Did you note whether or not the medical examiner, Dr. Scortibello, mentioned hypothermia as a potential cause of death in this case?
She did put that on the death certificate.
Do you concur with the diagnosis of hypothermia?
No, the body did not have any hypothermia. We know that normal body temperature is around 98, but we know that then at the hospital that Mr. O'Keefe's rectal temperature was around 80. So we know that his temperature went down. So there are two ways the body temperature can get down. It can get down while you're alive, or a dead body also cools when it's in a cold environment. So those are the two things you have to look at. This is a photograph I took from our forensic medical literature, and it shows the lining of the stomach. So the stomach is opened up, and we look at the lining of the stomach, and it shows a characteristic pattern of small ulcerations throughout the stomach, which are called medically Wisniewski's ulcers, and that allows a forensic pathologist to diagnose death from being exposed to a cold environment, and they're caused by, as the body gets colder and colder when it's alive, the small blood vessels in the lining of the stomach, they start to break, and then they're in the acidic environment of the stomach, and you get tiny little ulcers, which then look like small dots. And that is how at postmortem examination or autopsy, it's one of the findings I look for to see if a person died from hypothermia. I took this photograph from our forensic medical literature, and this was from a person who died due to exposure to a cold environment. And this is the stomach has been opened, and we're looking at the inside of the stomach. And the normal appearance is kind of pinky white. That's how it should look like. And what's abnormal here is all these black dots, which are the Wisniewski's ulcers, which are diagnostic of death due to exposure to the cold. This is the Mr. O'Keefe's stomach, which has been opened up, and we're looking at the inside. No, there are no ulcers. It's a normal appearance of what we would call a gross specimen. When you open the stomach at autopsy, you can see some redness of the normal lining of the stomach.
Someone to knock on a door, someone to make a phone call to 911, even anonymously. Not take responsibility, just to help. And there was only one person in this entire planet who could help him that morning, to give him a chance.
Isn't this an interesting argument by Hank Brennan, right? The idea that the only person in the whole world that could have done anything to help John O'Keefe was Karen Reed, who, like a cold-hearted evil monster, just let him lie there dead in the snow. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos, you know that I've analyzed Karen Reed on a number of occasions, and there is just nothing in her personality, in her history, in her behavior, and in the relationship to this point with John O'Keefe that would indicate she has been violent or that there are any violent tendencies whatsoever in this person. Did she get jealous? Yes. Was she insecure? Yes. Is there any evidence whatsoever that she would intentionally run over John O'Keefe and leave him to die? Absolutely not. But that's not all. Because in actuality, John O'Keefe, as we learned from Dr. La Posada, is already dead and has already been dead for very likely many hours. We also learned from Dr. La Posada that he did not suffer the head injuries that we see from slipping and falling on the lawn. That the lawn, no matter how cold it was, could not and would not have made the scraping patterns that we see on the back of John O'Keefe's head. So he must have fallen somewhere else. He must have fallen somewhere else, died, and then been moved. And if you'll notice the gash on the back of the head, when you look at the scene, there is not a huge puddle of blood, which for whatever reason the Commonwealth just completely ignores repeatedly. There's little tiny blood droplets, but given the seriousness of this head wound, you could expect to see very serious blood, right? Evidence of where this fall would have took place. But of course, we don't see that, and we don't see that because it didn't happen where John's body was found, which means without a shadow of a doubt, he was moved. And he was already dead when he was moved and placed outside. So, to say that it was Karen Reed who did this is simply absurd, is simply false and absurd. At this point, after everything that we've learned from some of the world's most credible experts, some of whom had no investment one way or the other, were not hired by one side or the other initially when they made their determination, but were hired by an outside agency, the federal government, to make their determination.
And that one person who could help him that morning was this defendant right here, Karen Reed. And she made a decision. In her Lexus with the shattered taillight, debris field all over the front yard, and John O'Keefe lying helpless like a child on the front yard.
That's interesting. So this is interesting because even Hank Brennan, in his own case in chief, presented no evidence of there being a debris field all over the front lawn. In fact, according to the Commonwealth, and I know this because I just meticulously went through line by line every statement made by every single police officer or investigator in this case that came into contact with this case on January 29th of 2022, where they found the alleged taillight and the alleged sneaker, were not anywhere near the front lawn, but they were in the street. In fact, the CERT team doesn't even touch the front lawn, despite the fact that the front lawn is where the flagpole and the fire hydrant are that John O'Keefe is found at. That's not where they search. They search in the road because Brian Tully is convinced, thanks to Jennifer McCabe and Brian Albert, that that's where this accident took place, that he's killed on the road and somehow is projected, although it defies the laws of physics, somehow 20 feet, 10 feet off the road and behind the vehicle, according to where the Commonwealth says that John O'Keefe would have been hit. So this, by Hank Brennan, is what? An attempt to play on our ignorance? An attempt to assume that the jury is not with it and hasn't already realized that there was no debris field, according to the Commonwealth, anywhere near or anywhere on the front lawn?
She made a choice. She didn't call 911. She didn't run to his aid. She didn't knock on a door. She made a decision about herself. In her Lexus, she drove away.
And let's consider the state of mind that Karen Reed is in when she drove away. Because this is something that doesn't get considered anywhere near enough during the second trial. I feel like maybe it came out more in the first trial, maybe not. Karen Reed leaves 34 Fairview And remember, the whole idea was that John was going to go in and then text her to let her know whether or not it was cool to go in. Right? So her intention wasn't to drop him off, it was to go in with him. But he doesn't call, he doesn't text, he never comes out of the house. So she pulls away in a fit, and by the time she arrives 10 minutes, from 34 Fairview to One Meadows to John's home, where we hear her pulling into the garage, leaving a voicemail for John, flipping out, "I hate you," blah, right, having a nervous breakdown. She's decided that he's ditched her. He's left her. And one thing that you have to understand, remember they are drinking, and that this is reminiscent for Karen of what had happened a month earlier on New Year's Eve when they go to Aruba, to a resort in Aruba with his friends, and he abandons her with his niece and nephew to go get drunk and hang out with all of his friends. It was like a group of like 20 of them. So she feels instantly like that's what has happened here and flips out, just starts panicking, angry, leaving these crazy texts, leaving these crazy phone calls. I think there's 52 texts and calls between the time that she leaves 34 Fairview and the time that they find John O'Keefe at 6 o'clock in the morning. So she's completely hysterical and drunk at this point, right? So the fact that the Commonwealth wants to paint this portrait of a vicious killer who leaves the scene and then he goes on her merry way and is like, "Ha ha, I got you." I mean, it's absurd, right? Because you guys know, you're true crime folks, right? If you're watching this, you probably are a fan of true crime in some form or fashion, or at least have seen enough Dateline episodes to know that killers don't generally call up the person they just murdered and scream and yell about how much they hate them 52 times between the time, right, throughout the night in question. So you tell me, does that make sense?
She was drunk, she hit him, and she left him to die. She was drunk, she hit him, and she left him to die.
I mean, it's just so absurd. And you get the feeling that Hank Brennan just thinks if I keep saying it over and over again, somehow it'll be more true, which is the same MO as the people that live outside of 34 Fairview. You get the feeling that they just keep saying, well, if we go in public and we just keep saying that we didn't do this, that eventually that'll be true.
Before I go through and detail the evidence, let's talk a little bit about the evidence as a whole. She was drunk. She was drinking that night. She was drinking McCarthy's with...
Along with everybody else, by the way. Everybody else was drinking. So if drinking is a factor, then that would be a reason to look at the people in the house who were just as drunk. Oh, and by the way, are cops driving around drunk all night, right? So if alcohol is a variable, don't you think that it would only be fair to consider everybody who's drinking in this scenario?
She was drinking at the waterfall. Her blood was taken with samples of a retrograde analysis, almost 2 to 3 times the legal limit. She was drunk. She hit him. The timeline in this case is beyond dispute.
So Hank Brennan says here, okay, we're going to go through the evidence. Let's do that generally. So then he presents the evidence for how she was drunk. And then he says, and she hit him. No. That isn't the evidence. That's your theory of what happened.
Dispute. You can accuse, assault, characterize, malign, twist. The timeline doesn't change. It is data. Data is data. The black box, the forensics from the SD card, we know exactly step by step where they were. We know in that window she hits him because he never moves again.
So explain to me how the statement about the data, again, like if I just keep saying it over and over again, maybe if I say it enough times, that'll make it more likely to be true. But the data in this case is not indicative of being hit by a car. That's the problem. That's a very inconvenient problem that Hank Brennan has here. And even if we only had the telematics data that he's referencing here, the black boxes from the car, the infotainment data, the cell phone data, even if that's all we have, there continues to be no evidence of a car accident as per that data that Hank Brennan keeps pointing to. In fact, that data has been overwhelmingly clear that there was no accident.
His healthcare data, the temperature on the battery of the cell phone.
Well, let's talk about the temperature on the battery of the cell phone, shall we? So, during Mr. Ian Whiffen's testimony, you remember Ian Whiffen, don't you? His testimony does come in handy when we are evaluating the temperature data on John O'Keefe's cell phone. Okay, so now let's address the issue of temperature and whether or not that proves that John O'Keefe's phone was left out in the cold like the Commonwealth is claiming it to have. Proof that John O'Keefe was out in the cold for all those hours after he was hit by Karen Reed on purpose with her car.
So if we take the time that we start out with a control temperature, and then we've got a battery temperature at 9:02, and this is the battery temperature of the iPhone, correct?
Correct.
And we've got 66.2 degrees Fahrenheit, correct?
Correct.
So is it fair to call that a baseline for purposes of what this chart is?
The device had already been outside for 2 minutes at that point, but yes.
Okay, so we'll just refer to 66.2. And then if we go from 9:02 down to 9:15, a period of 13 minutes, correct?
Correct.
So at 33.8 degrees and 13 minutes, what is the drop in temperature in degrees? What's the drop?
Sorry, between the 9:02 and the 9:15?
Right. So does it go from 66.2 to 35.6?
It does.
And sir, so I don't have to have you do a math on the fly. I've calculated that drop at 30.6. Does that sound about right?
That sounds correct, yes.
So you got a drop of 30.6 degrees in just 13 minutes at an outside temperature of 33.8, correct?
Correct.
We're going to come back to this, but what I'd like to do is to compare these two test scenarios. The one we just saw at 33 degrees Fahrenheit, where it dropped 30.6 degrees in just 13 minutes, again at an outdoor temperature of 33.8, and then test scenario one in a freezer, where it dropped 61.2 degrees in just 15 minutes. Now let's go to the slide 60, which was in your slide presentation yesterday, of what you stated was the temperature change in the iPhone of John O'Keefe on the morning of January 29th. So if we start out at 12:13, we see a battery temperature of 82 degrees Fahrenheit, correct?
Correct.
Then it drops a little bit to 77, a little bit to 72. And what I want to focus on is keeping the starting point for my questions here at the 12:37 time period on the morning of January 29th, and that's 72 degrees Fahrenheit, correct?
Correct.
So if you take the time period from 12:37 to 12:53, that's a 15-minute interval, correct?
Correct.
The phone only drops 11 degrees Fahrenheit in 15 minutes, correct?
Correct.
If you then go to 12:37 and give it a little bit more time, down to 1:36 a.m., the temperature, and that's just about an hour, right?
Correct.
And the temperature drops from 72 to 50, only 22 degree drop in an hour, correct?
Correct.
Now, if you compare this chart in the drop in temperature, for example, 12:37, 12:53, in 15 minutes, it's only dropping 11 degrees, to your experiments, where with the first scenario with the freezer, it dropped 50 degrees in a 15-minute period. Is it correct to say that there was a much more dramatic drop in temperature in your test scenario 1 than what actually occurred on John O'Keefe's phone for the time period we just covered in January 29th?
Yes.
And then with regard to even test scenario 2, where the temperature is 33.8 degrees, that's the ambient, the outdoor temperature,
Correct.
right? At that temperature, just above freezing, you've got a...
Sorry, that's below freezing.
I'm sorry?
It's below freezing.
What is freezing in Fahrenheit?
Don't know, but it's 0 degrees Celsius,
Right.
and it was -5 degrees Celsius at the time.
Right, but would you agree that, and I want to be fair to you because I know you use Celsius more
Yes.
than Americans who use Fahrenheit, but would you agree that 32 degrees Fahrenheit is the freezing point in Fahrenheit?
I honestly wouldn't know.
Okay, fair enough. So, in any event, in your experiment at 33.8 degrees Fahrenheit, you're getting a drop in your experiment in 13 minutes of 30.6 degrees, right?
Correct.
But much less drop in temperature on slide deck 60 of the actual iPhone of John O'Keefe on the morning of January 29th, correct?
Yes, correct.
Now, one of the things that comes out in this testimony that I'm skipping over is that Ian Whiffen does not know the temperature on January 29th in Canton, Massachusetts. God help us all. But, lucky for us, we do. So if you look at this chart, between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. on January 29th in Canton, Massachusetts, the temperature is between 0 and 25 degrees, and the low was 12 degrees, so we can assume the temperature is around 12 degrees. Isn't he a fun one? Canadian police officer Ian Whiffen, who is also the person who works for Cellbrite, the software program that has figured out how to steal data off of people's iPhones, because iPhones generally are made to be very secure, and even so secure that the government or police agencies are not able to get data off of these phones. So Ian Whiffen figured out how to do that, at least to some degree. And what his programs do is go in, pull that data, and then dump it. Now, you need a human being to make sense of the data dump. And that's where all the problems began in this case with different sets of people reading that data dump, trying to figure out what happened. For example, did Jennifer McCabe Google house long to die in the cold at 2:27 a.m. in the morning on the morning of January 29th, 2022? I am firmly a believer of the fact that she did. And if you've seen some of my other videos, you know why already.
The debris field, the DNA, the hair. And then she left him to die. He had a basal skull fracture, counter coup. You heard all about it when the back of your head hits the ground and the brain comes forward.
He did.
Dr. Wolf told us the reason why they have level 1 trauma centers around the country is because people can survive this injury if they get help.
Let's discuss what this head injury was very briefly here. I know we heard from Dr. La Posada, but let's discuss what we're talking about, right? So John O'Keefe's skull, the back of his skull, the bottom of his skull, shattered. And what happened as a result was the brain stem, where the part of your brain that controls all of your automatic functions like breathing, like your heart rate, crushed in on itself. So it wasn't just the coup contra coup injury that Hank Brennan is trying to communicate to you that John had. Because maybe by itself, just the fall backwards and the brain moving forward and back inside the skull, maybe that would have been something that you could, if you receive level 1 trauma care, recover from. But not if you shatter your skull and the brainstem gets crushed, which is precisely what Dr. La Posada explains happens here. And if you think about it, boy, does that make sense, right? Boy, is what she's saying. Not only does she say it with full conviction and a tremendous amount of credibility. I've never seen a more qualified person in my life to do something. It took, I counted, 47 minutes for the defense just to put forth Dr. La Posada's credentials in this case. This might be the most credible witness the world has ever known, and apparently Hank Brennan had used her before because that's how credible she is. She testified in something like 13, 14, 15 states around the country in the past. This is all she does now full-time because she's the most credible medical examiner the world has ever known. So it is quite clear. And by the way, at the very least, Hank Brennan's Dr. Wolf that he keeps referring to, who agreed there also was a coup contra coup injury here, agreed. Didn't agree with the second part of the assessment, but also, do we trust that Hank Brennan even gave him all of the proper medical records? I mean, we already know that Hank Brennan withheld x-rays from Dr. Welcher, and that's the real reason why he doesn't bring Dr. Welcher back after he fought so hard, in hearings outside of the presence of the jury to be able to do so. Because he didn't want ARCCA to testify, right? And did they do a hell of a job trying to keep ARCCA out of the courtroom. How many voir dires did ARCCA have to do? At least 3, I believe, between both trials. Gave full testimonies in the first trial, and that wasn't good enough for Hank Brennan, who continued to try to keep them out of the courtroom, doing anything he could. Actually, I would argue that Hank Brennan spent just as much time on trying to keep ARCCA out of the courtroom as he did his own case in chief, clearly, based on what we've seen during his case in chief and what we're seeing now in his closing. So, Hank Brennan just did not have enough evidence. I mean, that's the bottom line. No matter what he says, no matter what anyone tells you, there was not enough evidence because there wasn't evidence of a car accident. And that is the entirety of this case when all is said and done.
Ecchymosis, raccoon eyes, your brain swells, and you die.
No, that's not what happens, by the way.
She was drunk.
Yep. Okay. Well, the jury agreed with you there, Hank. So nice job. You proved she was drunk.
And that night was a recipe for disaster. But before we get to the drinking, in some ways, the fate of this night was sealed well before that night, because John O'Keefe and Karen Reed were in a toxic relationship. This relationship was crumbling. We hear lovey-dovey, and it was crumbling.
Well, I would agree with him that this disaster was long set in motion before this night, right? But not only because of the behavior of Karen Reed and John O'Keefe, but because of everybody involved, right? If you continually take a bunch of adults who've known each other for a long time, there's a lot of incestuous, relationships, and you just keep adding alcohol night after night after night. Yes, eventually something terrible is going to happen, Hank. You got that one right.
And we know it. And we know it because a month before, his niece Kaylee talks about when they went to Aruba. It should have been a wonderful event. It was discord. It was fighting. It was aggravation. And when they got back, the discontent was palpable. Miss Reed reaches out to Brian Higgins, text messaging, John O'Keefe.
Notice he's careful there, right? Watch that. That was interesting because Hank Brennan stopped himself from making too big a deal about the flirtatious texts, because you say too much about that, and what happens? You give Brian Higgins a motive. So he can't make too big a deal about the texts, though he thought about it there, right?
The relationship is crumbling, and you heard a little bit about what that relationship was like. Kaylee, his niece, told you, when there was an argument, John would do what John does. He would walk away.
That's right.
She described to you one time, to get away from the scene, he walked into his bedroom. But the defendant wouldn't let it go, pounding on his door.
That's right.
Having to get the last word.
Not to get the last word. So this is, again, where Hank Brennan has this wrong. It's just so frustrating to hear it because, from my view, it's just so clear what's happening here. And so to have this guy stand up there, pounding his fists, making this argument, I know it's an argument that he didn't win, but it's still frustrating to hear it, okay? So the reality here is you had two people who had two very different types of attachment styles, right? You had one who was a very insecure, anxious attachment. You had the other who was an insecure avoidant. So, of course, John would always try to walk away. And, of course, Karen couldn't tolerate that. Not because she needed to have the last word, but because if you have an anxious attachment, you can't feel okay until the argument is resolved. And your instinct is to chase that person down until you feel some resolution has been achieved, right? And the whole reason why Karen and John, why their relationship was crumbling, there was a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones from Karen's view was that she didn't feel, number one, appreciated by John, but number two, she really wasn't the center of his world. He was a busy guy. He obviously was working full-time as a Boston police officer, but he also was taking care of, his niece and nephew, one who was still a child, the other who's a preteen at the time. Right? So this is a single dad, and you can imagine the stress and strain on him because of that. And as Karen has pointed out in a lot of her interviews and in some of the shows, the Body in the Snow documentary, she makes a point to say that he didn't have enough help, that he was sinking and he was drowning under the weight of being a single dad, right? And that Karen did chip in a lot, but that he didn't like the way she behaved. He didn't like that she spoiled them by taking them, to Dunkin' Donuts, or by showering them with gifts, or by, spoiling them. And they had a fight this day, earlier in the day, that, again, is more evidence of the same two very different attachment styles, where Karen just keeps chasing John and he keeps saying, stop calling, I need a minute. He puts the phone down for an hour, and then something interesting happens, which is, of course, very true of somebody who is an insecure avoidant attachment style. Now that the calls have stopped, he starts to chase her a little bit. Now he's ready to resolve the argument because he's calmed down. He's walked away. Now he feels all right. He's ready to go back. And then we see that he gets jealous because Karen wants to use a plumber that, happens to live on her block and isn't trying to call John and his dad over to fix the plumbing issue. So Karen is not chasing John to get the last word. That's just absurd. She's chasing him to try to resolve the uneasy, anxious experience that she's having, the feeling of unease that she has inside because of the argument.
Never letting go of the fight. Kind of mirrors what happens on January 29, 2022. And maybe outward appearance, they got along. Maybe sometimes.
And that's true, by the way. That's the one thing I think Hank Brennan gets right. This incident did mirror what happened in Aruba. And that's part of what facilitated escalating from Karen Reed's perspective so quickly. It's part of the reason why she goes from sitting there outside of 34 Fairview and just flipping out. In fact, you could make the argument that had she not had that experience in Aruba, maybe she's a little bit more level-headed. Maybe she thinks, geez, it's weird that John isn't, texting me back. Maybe I should go in the house, make sure everything is okay. But instead, because of what had happened in Aruba, she immediately jumps to thinking he abandoned her.
Quietly they got along, but behind closed doors, relationships have up and downs. We have a bird's eye view into the relationship on January 28, 2022, because we have the text messages, not so lovey-dovey. The relationship is almost over. The tensions are simmering beneath the surface. They are not getting along. She believes Mr. Keefe is already halfway out of the relationship and he's not into it anymore. You will read them. You saw them. This relationship.
So what does that matter, by the way? Like, so what? Even if Karen Reed. So two things. One, I don't know whether or not their relationship was really on the verge of breaking up. Couples can stay together in unhappy relationships for a very, very long time, particularly when there's children in the middle. Karen was trying to kind of pull back because on this particular day, she was upset about the way John had treated her earlier that day, and she felt like a jerk just running back to him and going back to his house like nothing had happened. So she was kind of trying to pull back a little, but right, who knows what would have happened had this horrible disaster not occurred.
The relationship was unstable and at its end. And so fast forward that night. That night, after this discord, after the arguing, they go out and what do? They drink. And they drink a lot. So Keith drinks a lot, and Karen Reed drinks a lot. You've seen the McCarthy videos. You can call it 6, 7, 8, whatever you want to call it. You can see the shots into the mixed drinks. More shots into mixed drinks.
We get it.
Count them yourself. Over a half dozen mixed drinks in just a few hours. Sober? And then at the waterfall, a shot, a mixed drink. Now, it was brought up the waterfall that there was some type of discord between Brian Higgins and John O'Keefe. They knew each other. They were friends. Brian Higgins' conduct of speaking to Karen Reed is not honorable. It's not. But they were friendly. There was no adversarial relationship. There was no anger between them. What we heard is they...
Well, actually, let's be fair here. This is kind of an absurd thing for Hank Brennan to say, given that, everybody in this courtroom has eyes, including the jurors, and were able to see for themselves the waterfall video where Brian Higgins is being held back by Chris Albert, where Brian Higgins is pointing up at the screen, pointing up at John O'Keefe, pointing at him and saying, you, me, let's go. And we see that John O'Keefe from across the bar acknowledges him. Now, I don't believe that John O'Keefe perceived that as a threat. And then we see the follow-up text from Brian Higgins saying, are you coming here? So to try to then gaslight, typical Hank Brennan, the jury, it's like, come on, Hank, right? Like, come on. You're just digging yourself a hole here.
Barely greeted each other. Could we have slide one, please? At the Waterfall Bar, when you see John O'Keefe come in, here's him barely greeting him. That's him and Mr. Higgins. Barely greeting each other. Reality sometimes is different than argument. This is a celebratory move. Take that down, please.
I'm sorry, I didn't see it there.
A bunch of friends. They're playing around. They're hugging. They're grappling. This is a fighting technique for a murder 2 hours later. Is that the story?
Wait a minute. What does whether or not John and Brian Higgins have a friendly interaction when John first walks in, what does this have to do with anything, right? I mean, obviously, two people can be very friendly, and particularly if you've ever, been at a place where maybe a friend or a boyfriend of yours, or if you are a guy and you've been in a bar fight, things can go from very friendly to very unfriendly in a matter of minutes, right? Some guy who you think is your friend looks at some guy's girl the wrong way. That guy catches it as the drinks are flowing. Forget it. So to try to say, oh, look, they were kind of friendly, whether they were friendly or not friendly is just irrelevant, right? Because an hour later it has nothing to do with what happened the moment that they all walk in this bar.
They're practicing their moves to murder John O'Keefe.
Good try, Hank.
In the celebratory mood, you don't see any aggravation or animus between Brian Higgins and John O'Keefe.
So, just to be clear, for those of you that aren't sure what the point or purpose of pointing out the fighting moves at the waterfall between Brian Albert and Brian Higgins are Brian Albert, and this was verified by Nicole Albert during her first testimony by his wife, has a history of getting into fights when he's drinking, okay? That is just a fact. So Hank Brennan can try to say whatever he wants. What are these fighting moves? What do they show? They show that when these guys get drunk, their instinct, perhaps, is to fight.
Inevitably, the next morning, Karen Reed is brought to the hospital and they take her blood. Now, the government doesn't have to prove that she was drunk. It is either that she's over the legal limit, 0.08, or she had enough alcohol to affect her ability to operate a motor vehicle safely, but you will know that she was far beyond the legal limit. After the retrograde analysis, almost 2 to 3 times the legal limit. Almost 2 to 3 times the legal limit.
Great, you proved she was drunk. Good job, Hank.
Now, it's been intimated, not come out and said, that maybe she went home and started drinking after she got home. No evidence, mind you, no evidence. And that somehow that is why she had a high blood alcohol level. It's not appropriate for me to comment on the credibility of another attorney's argument, so I won't do that.
You just did.
But Karen Reed will do that for her. So if we listen to slide 2, she'll tell you exactly what she thinks about that claim.
My alcohol intake's probably about 5 or 6 or 4. The drinks that they were pouring me at McCarthy's, which is where I consumed most of the alcohol, was the weakest vodka tonic. It tasted just like old soda water with lime.
Slide 3, please.
Okay.
I wouldn't have gotten on the expressway. I wouldn't have gotten on the expressway at 12:15 on February 29th. I mean, it was quiet. The roads were very quiet. You can see it on the videos. And I was going, when I've had a few drinks in my driveway, it was very extra slow. I know my alerts aren't as sharp as they should be. But I shouldn't be driving.
Thank you.
Once again, they're proving she was drinking. She was drunk. Hank's Hank.
When they leave the Waterfall Bar at 12:12, you see a video, you have it in evidence, there's a still photo of John O'Keefe holding a glass. Not from the Albert's home. He didn't sneak into the house in the cupboards and grab a glass. From the waterfall, you see him with a glass, and in it is a straw. Take a look at that picture. And now from 12/12 on, we virtually have a historian in the data that tells us exactly where he went, exactly step by step where he went. And how do we have that? Well, we know the defendant's car had like a black box, and Judd Welcher, Dr. Judd Welcher, took the data from the black box and downloaded it so you can see the movements and the triggering events. And then Shannon Burgess, well, you don't like what he says, don't attack the data, attack the man. He can be mocked for his LinkedIn profile or his unupdated CV. But what he did is he found a key, critical piece of this case that did not exist before. He found it recently. And it was that SD card. The SD card that everybody missed, including the defense expert. Everybody missed it. So as much as you want to make fun of him, Shannon Welcher found the key so that
Shannon
we could have
Burgess.
the time and date and location coordinated for an impenetrable timeline that can't be broken. That's what Shannon Burgess did. And so we know on the way from the waterfall to 34 Fairview, Ms. Reed is driving drunk. Mr. O'Keefe is in the passenger side of the car, and they're heading their way to 34 Fairview, and they get lost. And now we have more data because John O'Keefe has a cell phone. And I said it in the beginning, it is a historian. It doesn't suffer from bias, it doesn't suffer from prejudice, it doesn't suffer from memory loss. It has data on it. And he puts on Waze, high location data, as Ian Whiffen would say. And it tells you second by second the speed, the location, the movement. That's what it does. And he has healthcare data on that phone. The healthcare data separately shows his movement. And that is critical. It is critical because it not only shows his movement, it shows when he does not move. That healthcare data is critical. And it's not subject to bias. It's not in dispute. There's no other contrary evidence. It is data. On the way to 34 Fairview, alcohol fuels tension. We know that. And we know from those text messages the tension in that relationship, and then there's a trigger. There is a trigger on the way because they're lost, and when John O'Keefe calls Jen McCabe for directions, Jen McCabe says something that triggers what's going to happen next. Could I slide 4, please?
Very close to the Alberts. In fact, when Jen was navigating John to the Alberts when I was driving, she said it's near Ashley's house. Ashley and John had hooked up prior to John and I dating.
And so as they travel to 34 Fairview, under the duress of this crumbling relationship, fueled by intoxication, we have triggers. Now, we know on their way there, we know from the data, where they went, how they moved. If we look at slide 5, Ian Whiffen showed you a guide. You could enlarge that just a little, please. And it shows you with the healthcare data, it registers as flights climb, but it doesn't mean someone's climbing upstairs. What it means is there's an elevation, and he...
Which, by the way, Ian Whiffen did not find. So, isn't it interesting how Hank Brennan is just lying now? Now he's just outright not telling the truth, which is so frustrating because Ian Whiffen did not tell us that the cell phone, the effort that he made to try to mimic the Apple Health data going up and downstairs, Ian Whiffen did not tell us that the phone did that, right? So no, there's no evidence whatsoever that just moving up and down hills in a car would mimic going up and downstairs to Apple Healthcare data. In fact, Apple Healthcare data turns out to be pretty freaking spot on, pretty accurate. So nice try. Nice try, Hank.
Breaks down the data, the red, the green, if you can move down, please, Ms. Gomez. And then the bottom left, that's 34 Fairview. You can see, second by second, the circles of their route, even the 3-point turn.
on Cedar Crest. That's what you see. At that point, they've left the bar. Remember, the battery temperature was 82 degrees. They're now in a car. It's now 77 degrees. Think about how accurate the battery temperature is, that it reflects the difference between being in a bar and being in a car. They take a 3-point turn at Cedar Crest. And because of Shannon Burgess and because of Judd Welcher, we have the data, and it's a triggering event. Remember, if there's an acceleration past 30%, it registers data on the car, and that's exactly what happens. There's a 3-point turn, and it all lines up with the cell phone after you synchronize the times. It's that simple. It's nothing complicated. There's nothing tricky. There's nothing devious about it. It's data. They do the 3-point turn, and you can match the cell phone clock with the Lexus clock, and when you do, you can reconcile the difference. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of argument, a lot of fights. Shannon Burgess says 21 to 29 seconds. Mr. DeSorga comes in. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to actually do anything. He wasn't given the invitation to test the data. He just looked at the report and made criticisms like a Monday morning quarterback. But even he, looking at the data, says, well, it's 3 seconds off or 2 seconds. Same window, same time. We can have all the arguments we want. They're there. They're together. The data matches up perfectly. Perfectly.
I'm not so sure that's what Mr. DeSogra said, but okay, Hank.
And so they make their way down to 34 Fairview Road. They don't stop. They don't stop at the driveway. They don't stop. And John O'Keefe gets out of the car. They go to the flagpole, and we know for 2 reasons. One, the data. And secondly, Mr. Nagel and Ms. Mason at Cedar Crest, at that intersection before it goes down to the right, they meet. They let Karen Reed go first. They fall behind in the truck. Now, at this point, Mr. O'Keefe has about 8 more minutes before the beginning of the end of his life. And he's in that car. He's in that car for most of it. Because Ms. Mason and Mr. Nagel don't see anybody get out of the truck. Nobody crosses the lawn. Nobody goes to a garage. Not just because they didn't see it. And they didn't. Not because they didn't see it. Because the healthcare data on the phone shows that John O'Keefe is not moving. The car is stopped at the flagpole. The healthcare data stops. The battery stays at 77 degrees. The data is the data. You can't change it as much as you want to. It's data. And they sit at that flagpole for minutes. It's 12, 24, 33 when they get there. They're there past 12:30. Remember, Ms. Mason and Ms. Nagel said they were there about 5 minutes and then they go. It's not exact, but about 5 minutes they said. So there's about 2 minutes left for John O'Keefe. And what are they doing in those 2 minutes? What are the last 2 minutes of his life that he can remember that would be open to him? They're arguing.
No, impossible. And here's the reason why. Because if these two were arguing, okay, you've already heard Hank Brennan admit it. Karen Reed would have chased him. So there's no world where John would have been getting out of the car and after 2 minutes. There's just no world. She would have kept him there. They would have continued to argue. There's no world where John would have been able to get out of that car after 2 minutes. He may have eventually gotten out of the car, maybe after 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes of sitting there. But there's just no world where after 2 minutes, John just gets out of the car. It just didn't happen that way. So Hank Brennan can say whatever he wants to say, but that is not what happened. And he's leaving out a big chunk of this data that he keeps referring to.
They're arguing. And we know they're arguing because Ms. Reed tells us through first responder Becker. She was sad. Remember, he sees her in the back of the ambulance and he's trying to calm her down? She was sad because her last moments were arguing.
And the reason that Karen Reed thinks that they've been arguing is because she's been arguing with John for the last several hours. She's been arguing with him. She thinks, in her drunken stupor, that he's gone in and abandoned her. So she thinks they're arguing. But John O'Keefe is dead very soon after he walks out of that car. So he's not arguing back. But that's the reason why she thinks they're arguing. And it is my belief that Karen Reed is in a brownout and that we have seen episodes of her being in a brownout before. So she doesn't and wasn't very clear about what happened, not only because she was drunk, but also because then she proceeds to kind of work herself into an absolute frenzy, which we know from her text messages. And that's before she realizes that there's something really wrong and then goes out to try to find him that morning.
They're in an argument. That's why they're not going in the house.
No, there's not an argument. There's no argument.
But John O'Keefe decides to get out of the car, and we know because the dome light goes on. That's what happens when you open a door. Whether he's bent down, he's standing outside,
Yes,
on the other
thank
side,
you for that,
the
Hank.
dome light is on. And then you see the data. John O'Keefe begins to move.
Yes, he does.
12:31:56. It's the first time he has moved since they got to the flagpole, and it will be the last time he moves in his life.
And by the way, there's no evidence that they were at the flagpole. According to the Nagel brother, they were essentially parked right in front of the house. And we'll take a close look at that in just a minute.
And he moves for 20 seconds. Ian Whiffen said that the satellites, they move, they reconnect, they pull information. He's no longer on high-frequency data because waves are shut off. Now it's more random. It's low-frequency. We would never suggest, and Mr. Whiffen did not claim, based on location data alone at that point, you can tell exactly where John O'Keefe is. What he said is it was readings all night. The bullet is always near the flagpole. That doesn't mean he was always near the flagpole. He could have moved. He could have moved in the circles and come back. Location data is consistent with him never leaving the flagpole. But that in itself is not enough. But there's more. There is more. There is the healthcare data. There is the temperature of the cell phone battery.
That's right. The temperature of the cell phone battery that proves that John O'Keefe was not outside for the 6-hour period that Hank Brennan claims he was.
So he moves for 20 seconds. It turns west. It does not say he walks to the house. That's not what the data says.
Yes,
it doesn't say
actually,
that, he goes
that
straight
is what it
line
says.
And he walks over to the door. In fact, could he even get to the door in 75 feet? Could he get there? Because when the investigation...
Yes, yep, he could get there. Yep, he could. 84 feet. Yes, he could.
For the defense testified, he measures from the driveway. They never stopped at the driveway. He never measures from the flagpole. He never measures from the flagpole to the garage door. So this fantasy that somehow he walked in the garage, even though there's no evidence, there's no witness, there's no data. 20 seconds of his life, and he moves. And healthcare data registers his steps. It could be pacing. It could be a straight line. It could be shaking the phone. We don't know. We don't know. We don't know everything.
No, it couldn't be those things because that's not what registers steps on Apple Health data. So good try, Hank. One thing I just want to point out as we're staring here at Peg O'Keefe and, John's brother, Paul O'Keefe, and John's father, you'll notice that at no time does her son or does her husband or anybody try to reach out a hand, just place their hand on the back of, Ms. O'Keefe's shoulder. Never at any time does anyone in this family show an act of kindness towards Ms. O'Keefe. And you just have to wonder about that. And, look, instead, Paul's like on his phone. It's just absurd.
We don't know every little detail and every little second. We don't have to. That's not doubt. That's not reasonable doubt. We know for that 20 seconds he's moving. And in that 20-second window, when he moves, he has his phone and he looks down, 12:32:09, he sees a text message from his friend, John McCabe. And he looks at the text message and he closes it. And then it happens. We know from the uncontroverted data from that black box, we know that Karen Reed, after he gets out of the car, drives away. She drives for at least 33 feet away from him. He's back near the flagpole. She's gone. It's over. Whatever argument is over. Whatever anger and flame has been dispassioned, she's moved on. He's separate from her. He's safe. And then she makes a decision.
He's safe.
That's what this case is about. Then she makes a decision. She could have driven home.
She did
She
drive
could have
home.
broken up with him. They could have talked about it the next day. Or like knocking on the door, like Kaylee said, getting the last word. She doesn't drive away. She takes that 6,000-pound Lexus and she makes a decision. And the decision is that she steps on the gas after banging it into reverse. Before we talk about what happens next, I want to talk to you a little bit about the charges in this case. And I hate to digress, but it's important so we really understand what we're talking about here. I have no authority to talk about the law in this case. The Honorable Judge Cannoni will do that. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the charges. Don't rely on my interpretation of the law. It's the judge who has that special power. But I want to explain to you a couple of things so when you think about what happens next, you can really assess the facts of this case with the charges against Ms. Reed. She is charged with second-degree murder. It sounds ominous, it is. It's a serious charge, second-degree murder. When most people think murder, they think shooting or stabbing somebody. It's natural to think that. Second-degree murder is different. It's not first-degree murder. I told you at the beginning of this case, I told you that we were not going to suggest or try to prove that Ms. Reed intended to kill John O'Keefe. That was never part of this case. We're not claiming that. I told you that we were not ever going to try to prove that she even intended to hit him. We never suggested we would try to prove that, and we're not trying to prove that she intended to hit him. We're not. What we are obligated to prove, and what we have proven from the evidence in this case of second-degree murder, is that she intended an act, and that is putting the car into reverse and heading back towards John O'Keefe. She intended that act. The question then becomes, did her conduct create a clear, plain, strong likelihood of death? Late at night, dark, beginning to snow, under the influence of alcohol, knowing where she stopped and left him after an argument, heading back in reverse to the exact spot or right near where she left him.
Absurd.
At over 24 miles per hour, accelerating at over 75%. You need to ask yourself, are you convinced if somebody does that create a plain and strong likelihood of death? And if there's no doubt in your mind...
Let me ask you this question, okay? This Lexus that's equipped with this trigger-happy system, we are being asked to believe by Hank Brennan that Karen Reed puts her foot on the gas at 75%, heads in reverse, and then makes contact with John O'Keefe's 220-pound body, and this very sensitive Lexus does not register an accident of any kind. Come on, Hank. The data, right?
Intended to hit that accelerator in reverse, and if that conduct will create a clear and plain likelihood of death, then she's guilty of that crime. Whatever the label is, she would be guilty of that crime. Now think about this. Let me give you an analogy. If somebody, maybe a teenager, someone young, impulsive, is on a bridge, and they see cars going by, and they have a boulder, and they want to throw the boulder off, they're not looking to hurt anybody. They're not meaning to kill anybody, but they throw the boulder off the bridge because they want to see the car break, the thrill.
But this is, by the way, not what the Commonwealth is claiming. They're not claiming that Karen Reed had no idea what her behavior was going to do, and she was just wanting to see what happened when she threw a boulder over a bridge, right? So I don't really get this at all.
And when they throw that boulder off the bridge, and it comes down and lands on the car, and there's
Look at David Udetti's face. He's like,
car,
what are you talking about?
And it then goes through the roof and kills the person in the car. Did they intend to kill that person? No, they were trying to have a thrill throwing the rock. Did they have the malice to want that person dead? No, they didn't. But that would be an example of second-degree murder. When you take a boulder and throw it off a bridge, there's a plain and strong likelihood of death. When Karen Reed, in the midst of that tension and fight, after she drove away and was gone, disengaged, when she came back for the last word,
in the darkness, the beginning of the snow, under the influence of alcohol, and decided to stop her Lexus, decided to put it in reverse, decided to accelerate 75% in the exact same direction of where she left him, and then hit him.
Now, I don't know if any of you have seen when Turtle Boy tried to replicate the experiment, driving backwards so that it would replicate what the Commonwealth is claiming here to hit John O'Keefe. But because of the fact that there is a curved road that really starts to curve right at 34 Fairview, there is no way that a person driving backwards in reverse would have not been up onto the lawn. It wouldn't have happened. Even a professional driver going 24 miles an hour would not have been able to successfully miss the curve. Okay. And we can take a closer look at that. But this idea that somehow Karen Read is a NASCAR driver now and is able to perfectly drive along this curb going backwards at 24 miles per hour, it's just absurd. It's just absurd.
And he died. I suggest to you that is second-degree murder. The other charge, operating under the influence of alcohol, manslaughter. It's different. It's a totally different and separate charge. Was she under the influence of alcohol? And then secondly, did she operate her Lexus wantonly and recklessly in a way that would very likely result in serious injury? When you're under the influence of alcohol and you drive a 6,000-pound Lexus in the heat of the moment at the direction of where somebody is, whether you intend to hit them or not, I submit to you that is wanton, it is reckless, and any reasonable person would think it's very likely that serious injury would result.
So, but again, you see that this is the problem the Commonwealth has. They're trying to get it to have it both ways. So on one hand, Hank spends 20 minutes telling us about what a horrible, evil individual Karen Read is, how their relationship was toxic, how it was at its end, and that's why Karen Read needs the last word and runs him over on purpose. Now he's shifting and trying to say, well, whether it was on purpose or not doesn't really matter. And this is the problem with the Commonwealth's case, not to mention most of their information is just false. But you're expecting to convince these juries beyond a reasonable doubt, even if the defense put on no case, even if the Commonwealth, this entire trial stops after the Commonwealth's case, they don't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Karen Read is responsible for hitting John O'Keefe. And any reasonable person can look at the injuries on John O'Keefe's body and say those were not caused by a vehicle. Particularly if you spend any time at all looking at what happens when people are hit by vehicles. And by the way, the Commonwealth is saying that John died from a fall, from an injury where he fell backwards.
It's not a matter of intending to kill. It's not a matter of intending to hit. It is the conduct of the operation and the risk that is created. And so those two charges are two of the three. The three is leaving the scene, knowingly causing death. And we'll get to that. So now, sadly, we need to get back to 34 Fairview Road where we left. We know from the tech stream data that she drove 33 feet at least, because it only picks up a 10-second window. And when it starts to pick up the data, we know she's driving at a speed. So it's more than 33 feet. We just don't know. And then when she comes back, she covers the 33 feet and 50 more. 80 feet. 80 feet. Over 80 feet. Now, nobody...
Wait a minute. She covers 80 feet in reverse. But remember, according to the Commonwealth, Brian Higgins has his Jeep parked in front of the mailbox at 34 Fairview. with a giant plow on the front.
Ever suggested, even Dr. Welcher, when she collided with them. This data doesn't tell you collision. It's a 6,000-pound Lexus. It's a 216-pound man. It's not going to show a blip. It could have been in that 10-second window. It could have been 2 seconds after. It could have been 4 seconds after. But it's in that pocket of time, and we know it. We know it because when you reconcile the data with the phone, that 20 seconds is in the same window of that 10-second window coming back. So even if it's a couple seconds later, 4 seconds later, whatever Mr. DeSorgo wants.
Oh, whatever time, we don't know. It was 10 seconds, 4 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever. No difference. Now, remember the way that Karen Reed left 34 Fairview on this morning. Remember how upset she is by the time she gets back to One Meadows, right? Because she doesn't hear back from John once he leaves the car. And of course, Karen's probably not looking behind her to see, or even to the side to see where John goes. She's not watching him walk into the house, right? So he gets out. We know he gets out. The dome light goes on. He gets out of the car. She's not paying attention to where he goes, which door he goes into, whatever. And we don't know, right? We don't know where he goes. But from that moment on, Karen Reed is expecting to hear back from him. And when he doesn't get back to her, is it possible that she peels out of there pissed off, that she winds up, driving forward and then having to reverse to turn the car around? Hey, maybe. But there's no way that it happens the way that the Commonwealth are stating, not only because it's impossible when you try to back up the 84 feet the way he's talking about in front of 34 Fairview, there's a curb. She would have went up onto the grass without a doubt.
You're on the curb.
Am I really?
Yeah, you're on the grass. No.
See, there's a curb here.
Your back tire's up. You gotta drive. There you go. How fast did you go?
14.
14.
14.
Wow.
That was fast. I mean, anything. I got to 13. I'm like scared.
Yeah.
Out of control at 14.
That looked fast.
Out
to
of
me,
control
too.
at 14.
Really fast?
Coming at me pretty fast. I kind of jumped a little bit out of the way. Yeah, you went right up on it. You can see your tire
At
mark.
14, you went up on the curb.
Yeah, right here.
14, they're saying she went twice as fast, 24.
She's better at this. She's really good at this.
I mean, that's a 1 in a million shot because there's an angle too. She would have had to cut the wheel exactly.
Yeah, it's like, dude, it comes at you fast. Like,
Yeah.
How do you? Let me try that again.
Okay. How was it?
17. It's a new record. I mean, I can't even, I went 2 up on that one, and we'll see. I mean, dude, it gets scary. Like, somebody is like, I couldn't imagine having a person there and doing that. Like, that's, like, it can't be manslaughter. Like, if she did that on purpose, which she didn't, obviously, because she's not, you have to be a fucking psycho.
Right.
That's all the time thinking of, like, you gotta be psycho to do something like that.
Sure.
So, way. I mean, that's 7. That seemed fast.
Yeah.
I don't think it could have gone faster than that. I mean, reckless in the snow too. Think of how loud that would have been.
Yeah, and she would have pulled forward and then do that, and he's just standing here.
And my car can accelerate faster than hers too.
Right.
So we'll see.
And what would he be doing just standing there?
I don't know. I guess he just wants to get hit.
Yeah.
Number 1. Number 2, no collision is registered on this telematics, on the data, like Hank Brennan likes to say. So he's trying to say, well, it wouldn't be. You be the judge of that. Right? Really, Hank? And now he's telling us, well, who knows what time it happened.
He stops moving. John O'Keefe stops moving. Forever. Forever. Next slide 6, please. You'll get to see this more closely, and you can probably see it where you're sitting, but there's important data. Data doesn't lie. and you will see acceleration, 75%. You will see speed, 24 miles per hour backwards.
Oh, now it is.
Distance.
So now it's clearly
80 feet.
24
That's what
miles
you're
per
going to
hour.
see in this data on that night.
And you'll remember from ARCCA's 24 mile per hour test in reverse, right? There's a number of problems with this little theory. Number one, the tail light does not shatter to the same degree that it does according to the Commonwealth, right? So 24 miles per hour does not destroy the diffusers. But not only that, it would have sent John behind the vehicle. Oh, but yeah, the problem with that is there's allegedly a Jeep back there.
Anger, although not necessary in any of these charges, anger can be inferred for somebody to come back that hard, that fast, that reckless, that obvious, likely to create a plain and strong likelihood of death.
And by the way, in my mind, there's even still controversy about whether or not Karen Reed had possession of the car during key cycle 1162. I have had some experts tell me off the record that they do believe that the car data would have aligned with Karen Reed during having the car at this time. I've had other people say impossible. A key cycle simply means when a car is turned on, not turned on all the way, but just when it's turned on. Now, by definition, when the car's ignition turns on, so when the engine is started, that is, by default, also a key cycle. So you can have key cycles without ignition cycles, but you can't have ignition cycles without key cycles. Cars track every single key cycle, okay, from the time that they are first started up. Trooper Paul gets the car for testing at key cycle 1164. Working his way backwards, decides that key cycle 1162 must have been the time of the incident. Does he go back and look for the video evidence to verify where the car was at key cycle 1162? No, just a little bit of an oversight on his part, though. So let's do that for him. Here's the car at key cycle 1163. Working our way backwards, here is key cycle 1163, when the car was driven off the tow truck and into the Sally Port. And here's the car at key cycle 1162, where Trooper Paul believes the incident where Karen backed into John happened. Here's the car at key cycle 1162, making a 3-point turn, driving the car onto the tow truck bed. A car records speed and distance based on how fast the tires are rotating. So, if, for example, you were stuck in mud and the tires were rotating really quickly in reverse, but you didn't go anywhere, you might conclude from reading the car data that the car was traveling in reverse at 24 miles per hour, even though the car never went anywhere at all. And in Trooper Paul's mind, he just assumed it was a misfire on the part of the car recording key cycles.
Car had to be started and put on a tow truck. That would be key cycle what?
I don't know how. I can't speak to the fact that recorded a key cycle at that time.
I can't hear you.
I can't speak to the fact that would record a key cycle at that time.
Okay. If the car was turned on and driven onto a tow truck, would that be a key cycle?
I don't know, because these keys record different ways, so I can't speak to how or why it did not record on there.
He figures it just must not have recorded it. And of course, In trial 2, when the defense tried to clear all this up, guess what happened? The judge, of course, shuts it down.
You took photographs of the vehicle control history, including key cycle 1167?
Correct.
And in this screenshot, we can see 4 text stream events.
Actually, can you zoom in on the key cycle?
Oh, sure.
Because I think when I got to, no, scroll.
We can go back so we can see the 4 text stream events. I just want to reestablish the foundation here. In this screenshot, we can see 4 text stream events that are associated with key cycle 1167, correct?
Correct.
But isn't it true, Dr. Welcher, that there were actually 10 text stream events associated with just that one key cycle 1167?
Correct. I gave you the original files.
Right. So you are aware that the Commonwealth had maintained up into your firm's engagement that...
Are you saying there's no basis for the question?
They're saying.
All right, I'm going to allow the question and I'll hear it.
You are aware that the Commonwealth has maintained up until your engagement in September of 2024 that all text stream events associated with key cycles 1164, 1165, and 1167 occurred while the Lexus was in the custody of the Massachusetts State Police at the Canton Police Department.
Okay. So the objection is sustained. You need a foundation, Mr. Lessie.
Sir, as part of your work in your review of the many documents that you referenced on your direct examination, did you review the text stream events associated with the Lexus SUV?
I reviewed the one I downloaded.
Pardon me?
I reviewed the one I downloaded.
Right. And did that, what you download, include key cycles 1164? Did it include that?
It did.
Did it include 1165?
It did.
And did it include 1167?
It did. It did not include 1166.
I didn't mention 1166, sir. I only mentioned 1164, 1165, and 1167. I purposefully skipped because I didn't understand you had reviewed it. So here's my question. You therefore, based upon the fact that you reviewed them, and you said it's important to understand timing, etc. That's very important in your forensic analysis, correct?
Yes, sir.
So let's go to the timing question and you understand where the Lexus has been at various points in time. You testified to that in direct, whether it was at the Canton Police Department, whether it was being towed, correct?
In addition to having Mr. Burgess' analysis of the data.
In addition to Mr. Burgess' analysis, so in that analysis contained locations of where the Lexus had been.
It contained where it had been and also include date and time, when it was turned on, when it was turned off.
Exactly. So not only did you have all the locations, you had dates and times associated with the location where the SUV, the Lexus SUV, had been, correct?
Correct.
Now to the question. Based upon that review, that knowledge, that understanding, those bases, you're aware, and you've reviewed, by the way, Trooper Paul's reports, correct?
I have.
There were 2 reports of Trooper Paul. There was his original CARS report and then a supplemental report that were listed in the documents you reviewed. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that, but I'll take your word for it.
I don't want you to have to take my word. Do you recall, sir, that there were do you recall that there was a report of Trooper Paul?
Yes.
Okay, and you read that report, I assume, sir?
I did.
And it would be important for you to read that report and read it carefully because it addressed the subject matter that you were addressing, correct?
No. I did my own independent analysis. As a matter of fact, it'd probably be more important that I don't do that to avoid confirmational bias.
But you did read Trooper Paul's report,
Of
correct?
course.
So, you therefore are aware that the Commonwealth has maintained up into your engagement.
Yeah, I'm going to see a sidebar on this.
Yet another example of how the so-called judge in this case went out of her way to obstruct justice. So thanks to the so-called judge, Beverly Cannoni, we just don't know who had the car when and which key cycle was who doing what. Some people are adamant that yes, Trooper Paul began testing at key cycle 1167, and therefore Karen Reed would have had the vehicle out in front of 34 Fairview at key cycle 1162. Others still believe that Trooper Paul began testing at 1164, and therefore key cycle 1162 could not have been Karen Reed behind the wheel the way that the Commonwealth claims. But either way, at least not unless somebody from the defense team gives us that information, we just won't and don't know. Somebody made a mistake. Because according to Trooper Paul, she would not have had possession of the vehicle at key cycle 1162.
It tells a story that can't be changed. Can't be attacked. ARCCA, they did some crash test dummies. You know what else they do? Text stream data. There's nothing about that data that is uncertain. Nothing.
Yeah, it would have been really interesting, actually, to have had ARCCA examine the text stream data. I would have loved to have seen that, but let's keep it simple, right?
Take that down, please. When Miss Reed hits John O'Keefe, collides with John O'Keefe, we don't know if he went in the air a foot. We don't know if it was how much of a clip it was. We don't know if he stumbled back, but we know there's a collision. There's no doubt there's a collision because her taillight's all over the yard. It's all over the yard.
Except none of it was there during the first search conducted by the Canton police. So according to Hank Brennan, it's all over there. No, we know a collision occurred because there's taillight all over the place, except that taillight conveniently shows up on the scene after the Commonwealth has possession of Karen Reed's Lexus. How inconvenient for them. And that's despite many, an enormous effort by multiple individuals, including the DA's office, to try to say that that car does not get to the Sally Port before the search at 34 Fairview begins. But it does, despite their efforts to try to bump it up so that the search happens before the car gets to the Sally Port. But, oh, lo and behold, guess what? The video evidence proves that that car is there before the search team begins.
The back of his head, his basal fracture. He's then lying there helpless. When Miss Reed leaves, she leaves behind tons of her taillight all over the yard. All over the yard. It's called
so absurd.
And you've seen videos. You can't replicate the exact contact. You can't because you would need where the person was hit, how fast the person was going, but you know what happened because when you look at the debris field, when a light is broken, it's no different than what was on the front yard. It's no different. She leaves.
According to who, Hank?
She leaves her taillight behind. She goes home. And on her way home, you know she's still angry. You know she's still angry because she starts leaving him voicemails. Slide 7, please.
Like the worst murderer the world has ever known. After she murders her boyfriend, she proceeds to call him 50 times, leaving angry voicemails. Right, so, but that's what Hank Brennan wants us to believe. That is what he's expecting us to believe.
Healthcare starts at 12:31:56. 12:32:04 to 12:32:12 is the data which is adjusted when you reconcile the clocks with the Lexus. 12:32:09 is when Mr. O'Keefe closes his phone after looking at Jen McCabe's text. 12:32:16 is his last steps. Because the disorder says that red range should move a little bit, 2 or 3 seconds. They can move it 4 seconds, 5 seconds. It doesn't matter. It's all in the same window. It doesn't change. We could have slide 10, please. Can you play that, please? Thank you. Each one of those pegs represents 10 feet. You can't place that car where it was in front of Fairview. You just can't. The data doesn't tell you that, but that tells you the movements of that car. Now, as John O'Keefe sadly lays on the ground, abandoned, you're going to have to ask yourself a question for charge number 3, leaving the scene knowing somebody was injured and then died. You're going to have to ask yourself, is there evidence that Miss Reed knew that she had hit him? Don't need to prove it for murder 2. Don't need to prove it for OUI manslaughter. But for the 3rd charge, Commonwealth has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt she knew she hit him. We weren't there, but there was an eyewitness. There was a guide. And that eyewitness tells us that she knew. And that eyewitness is Karen Reed herself. She tells you that she knew. Could we have slide 8, please?
Could I have hit him? Did I hit him?
How could that have been?
I don't know what that could have been. It was howling wind. I had YouTube blasting on the stereo. And I thought, did he somehow try to flag me down, which was the reaction I was hoping to garner as I slowly pulled away from the house. Did he come out and maybe trip or bend over to pick up his cell phone and I ran over his foot and then he passed out drunk? I mean, I didn't think I hit him, but could I have clipped him?
When she left Fairview and left John behind, she didn't think he was mortally wounded. But she knew she hit him. She knew she hit him. And so when she made her way back home, not only did she leave the field all over the front lawn, but she took evidence with her too. Hair, DNA on the taillight, and she drove back to John's house. And she started calling on the way back, 12:33, just a minute and a half later. And then her messages show her anger. You see, this was John's fault. This was John's fault. And her phone calls tell you about the tone and the destruction of that relationship.
And then you wonder, how, Hank, are you going to account for the fact that she was so distraught once she realizes that he's not coming back, right? Because if this relationship was over and she's just this cold-hearted murderer, why is she losing her mind when she finds him at 6 a.m?
So then she calls someone that she doesn't know very well. She calls Carrie Roberts. But now she has to pivot because someone has seen her in the exact spot that John will be found soon. Whether she's the first one there or somebody else, John will be found. Maybe Lucky missed him. It's a snowstorm. You can't see. But someone's going to find him at some point. So she calls Carrie Roberts. It's no longer she left him at the waterfall. She pivots. And she calls, Carrie, Carrie, Carrie. John's dead. I think he got hit by a plow. Why do you think she chose those words? Why did she choose those words? Because she knew that there was a collision with a large motor vehicle and she had to substitute her 6,000-pound Lexus for another big vehicle.
Or she figured he was walking, but because she had left him, he had to walk to wherever he was going, and because there are plows out, maybe the plow didn't see him and hit him. That could be the other reason. Just saying.
By a plow. And so now we have the introduction of Jen McCabe and Carrie Roberts. Phone calls.
Biggest mistake that Karen Reed makes is calling Jennifer McCabe. Biggest mistake.
Never, ever wanted. A worse nightmare to get a call like that. For what's going to happen, what they're going to see, what they'll never be able to forget. But because the defendant is John O'Keefe's girlfriend, they wake up in the middle of the night, in a blizzard, out of their kindness, their loyalty, their devotion to John O'Keefe. And when she calls them and tells them that she wants them to come out, this soccer mom.
Yeah, that's the reason why. It's not because Jennifer McCabe has an opportunity to now control the narrative. No, it's not that. It's because she's a soccer mom and just wants to be helpful because of how much she loves John.
It was a perfectly normal life.
Perfectly normal.
Drawn into this whole farce. And she answers that call. She gets out of bed. The spirit and kindness she displays.
What a disgrace.
Put herself in that position because someone asked for help. Because that's what good people do.
Right.
Carrie Roberts didn't know Jen McCabe. They both knew John. They met each other once years before. Carrie Roberts, separately at that time, answers the call. Gets out of bed. Drives to go help
Because they have a common denominator, a common bond. John O'Keefe. And so you hear and see at 5:07 the defendant leaves Meadows. She leaves. And Kaylee is behind waiting. And you see her back up, and Judd Welch just showed you all of those demonstrations where you could see the unsettled snow in the back, and after the bump you can see the pieces missing, no taillight. There's no taillight on the ground, all the white snow. There's
Oh, no,
crack,
no,
there's
of course
break.
not, because you
It's a
examined
notch.
that carefully,
It's a
Hank.
But
Of course, you would know
the
there's no taillight
has already
there.
been
No,
broken,
no.
Because when you look at the video, not one little piece, it's still framed, little angle with the light, the brakes are. You take a look, you'll be able to slow it down. You'll see the exact same piece is missing. Because it's back at Fairview. That's why it's missing. It's not there, it's back at Fairview.
Right, of course it's back at
And
Fairview.
then she
Of
leaves
course.
at
it is.
5:07. She gets to Jen McCabe's about, 5:35? 28 minutes. It's about a 10-minute ride. Where does she go in 28 minutes? Where does she go?
Goes
We don't
looking
know.
for
We don't
John.
have data for that. But we know when she gets to Jen McCabe's house,
And I described this to everyone, so you probably know this before, but John looked like a buffalo on the prairie. It was just a lawn and a heap that it wasn't a bush or a hydrant or a dog. It was a weird shaped lump at that time in those elements. And I was looking to find him on the side of the road. I was expecting I'd find him.
Thank you. Ian Whiffen, data. The cell phone battery gets the cool air, presses on the battery, the cell phone battery drops. Healthcare data, he has not moved since that 22nd. Hasn't moved.
Interestingly, though,
They start shaking him.
here's a question for you. I mean, is it that he hasn't moved, or is it that his phone hasn't moved? Right? Because, okay, yeah, you want to say that the phone was in his pocket, right? But let's say that he gets into a fist fight with Brian Higgins and the phone falls out of his pocket. Is it possible that the phone falls onto the ground? And maybe John's up and moving around a little bit longer than that even? Is that possible?
You're going to see, when you look at the records, that healthcare data starts to move. He's been there all night. All night. Nobody else. Her. And so when they try to help...
He has been there all night. That's right.
Remarkable. Man Proctor and the bad government, I know it doesn't reconcile with no DNA on this piece or that piece. I know it doesn't reconcile with everybody setting up the girl. I know that doesn't reconcile. But the reality is, you have independent, core people who hear her say, I hit him. I hit him. And the attempt is to betray everybody. That's a liar. But you don't have to rely just on...
But see, that's the thing about this, right? Not everybody, number one, it has to be lying. All you need is a bunch of people who have been influenced by the media, influenced by everybody else's story, influenced by having, I don't know, the detective lieutenant of the Massachusetts State Police Department sitting in on all of their interviews with the Commonwealth, who he or they know want to hear that they heard I hit him. Hank Brennan loves to talk about witness intimidation, right? And Turtle Boy, but I ask you, how intimidating would it be to have Brian Tully sitting in on your interviews with the Commonwealth before you testify? Would you be more afraid of Turtle Boy or Brian Tully? Because out of everybody involved in this case, with the exception of maybe Brian Albert, Brian Tully is far and away the much more intimidating figure, and not to mention the fact that he has all the power in the world. He can just, on a dime, start digging through your bank records, your phone records, your everything you've ever done in your whole life because he feels like it. And that's exactly what he did to both Karen Reed and to Turtle Boy, though he failed miserably at, convicting in front of a grand jury. So these I hit him statements are extraordinarily sus, not because anybody's being malicious, but because Let me tell you how incorrect memory can be and how easily we get things wrong, that we will swear up and down we heard or that we saw or that we remember. That's number one. Number two, I love how the state just keeps overlooking how completely out of her mind Karen Read is this morning. I mean, she is so dysregulated. They love to point out that she's drunk, but then they don't ever want to point out that that may have had an influence on her mood and on the words and on the actions, on everything that happens that involves her on that morning. Right? They want to point out, oh, you know, everything she says is so important, but at the same time, they've taken away her rights. They've sectioned her that morning because they're afraid she's going to kill herself. Right? Police, we hear from Sergeant Good who says, yeah, I stopped interviewing her because she was so crazy. Right? This is a woman who's teetering on delusional, who sees blood on her hands and thinks it's from her period instead of the man that she just tried to resuscitate for the last 30 minutes. That's how delusional Karen Read is. And yet we're expected to believe that from Hank Brennan that everything she says, that her words should be weighted in gold on this morning. I mean, it's just so absurd. It's so absurd. You know, it's so clear from this closing argument that the Commonwealth has basically nothing. Has nothing. And honestly, and I stand by this, I know there's no way for us to ever know it, but if the defense had not put on a case, I still think you would have got a full acquittal. Exactly the same thing would have happened because they just did not have enough. You wouldn't have probably heard those jurors say that they think Karen Read is innocent, but what they would have been saying is there's not enough here to convict a woman of murder of a police officer for the rest of her life. No way. Because there isn't.
These good people, although you should. You don't have to. Because we have a guide, and it's Karen Read. Slide 17.
Some of the specifics. Did I never? I always said I hit him, but did I really say this many times as law enforcement explaining I said it?
Thank you. I know it doesn't fit the theme, the theory, the story, but she tells you herself. She endorses those good people exactly what they had heard. She tells you herself. She hit him.
It's just amazing because, you know, you see the Commonwealth playing these clips, but if I'm a juror, I mean, there's just no way I trust this guy at all. They're only playing these teeny little clips, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. Like, what am I supposed to extrapolate from that? You're not left to ask, okay, well, what was the larger context? What was the question? What else did she say? And the fact that they don't play anymore makes you think that they're being intentionally misleading, that they're trying to pull little clips or statements to help it fit their narrative, right? So it's like, well, Hank, if you're going to play it so that I can hear and see what the hell she's really talking about. Otherwise, it just makes me suspect of you.
It's inconvenient. But the truth has a way of seeping up to the daylight. It can be oppressed and suppressed.
That's right, Hank. It sure does.
And twisted, but it rises. It rises. And it is not a coincidence. There's no coincidence that Mr. Nuttall and Ms. McLaughlin hear exactly that. She tells you.
Mr. Nuttall, who believes from the jump that he sees a big puffy coat on John O'Keefe, right, on the scene, and Ms. McLaughlin, who turns out is lifelong friends with the Alberts. You know, it's like, even if they're not being intentionally misleading, even if they believe what they're saying is true, there's absolutely no incentive to tell the truth. There's no incentive to hear it any other way. At that point, it's like, no matter what you hear, if you hear anything at all that even remotely sounds like, could I have hit him? Did I hit him? I hit him. What are you going to say?
And Jen McCabe, when she's sitting next to or standing next to Miss McLaughlin, she tells you she saw or heard the same thing. Remember what happened to her on the stand when she had the audacity to say, I heard her say it? What happened to her? This woman who never even wanted to leave her home that day, pulled out into a storm to see her best friend dead. What happened when she had the audacity to say that? And now we know that the defendant herself said the same thing. That the defendant then wants to run back to the ambulance, so she goes with her, never finishes or completes the input. Because he wasn't. He wasn't, but that does not change. It doesn't create a conspiracy, doesn't invent a dog, it doesn't make somebody in a house something they're not. It just doesn't. When you read those text messages, they're hard to look at. It's unfair. It's unfair. And if there's a penalty more than being fired, well, maybe that penalty would be deserved. But it has nothing to do with the justice in this case. It just doesn't.
Well, absolutely, that's not true. And according to the state police who made the decision to fire Trooper Proctor, that's not true. Because they fired him for bias. Because within 6 hours of taking this case, this group of cops already sets in motion how they're going to get taillight pieces to that second search to try to make sure that they shore up a conviction of Karen Read. So these guys had Karen Read guilty based on the statements that they got from Jennifer McCabe. Full stop. That is what happened. So as much as we want, Hank Brennan wants to try to tell us, oh, well, nothing that these texts don't matter. Nothing could be farther from the truth. These texts 100% give us everything that we need to know about these investigators, about this investigation. Not only that it was just ridiculously biased from the start, but that they had evidence on their mind, that they were concerned about what they were going to be able to prove, what they weren't going to be able to prove, that they were going to protect Brian Albert at all costs, that they were going to do everything they could to make sure the homeowner didn't get in any trouble, and that they were going to bring the reins of hell down on Karen Read because serious charges were coming for that girl. They believed wholeheartedly a Boston cop was murdered by his girlfriend, and they were going to go to the ends of hell to make it cut and dry and bring serious charges on her. That was it. And that is, by the way, what the jurors have echoed as well. And that's the truth of this case, whether you believe that Karen Read did this or not.
Nothing about the interviews of Miss Read. She doesn't know about the DNA. She doesn't know about the shards in the arm or in the clothes. Strike that in the clothes. She knows nothing about that. So in 90 days, she didn't see any lower body injuries. She didn't see any lower extremity injuries, which are very common in car collisions. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen because she, in 90 days, saw a fraction of the information. A fraction. And we know now, argument back and forth for days about lower body injuries, the suggestion is a car accident can affect everybody differently depending on the angle, the scope, the speed. Some people can get plowed over by a car and have no injuries. Some people can get touched lightly and have more injuries.
Let's see. Do any of us know anyone who's been plowed over by a car and not had any injuries? I'm not sure.
There was the debate about no lower body injuries. Well, ARCCA dispelled that in their dummy test that you can have a collision with no lower body injuries. They did that for us.
Really?
So
I missed that one.
That at the time, in 90 days, that she doesn't have enough information to say consistent with a car accident doesn't mean there's no car accident.
Scorty Bello, who also gets the cause of death incorrect, right? By believing that he dies of hypothermia, which, by the way, is incorrect. So I don't know what to say about Irene Scorty Bello. I guess I want to say thank you for not feeling the pressure or breaking under the weight of the pressure of the police in this case, who tried to get her to change her determination. But she also gets the cause of death wrong. So you wonder, maybe she was influenced by the investigation or by the cops, at least in that way, right? Because she's saying she saw Winooski spots, but then when we are later shown pictures of John's stomach from Dr. La Posada, there are no spots. So what does that mean? I don't know.
Fighting, it was a relationship in decline, and he got out of the car, and he had a brief window of life left. But when he got out, and she drove away, she couldn't let it go.
Oh, man.
She got drunk.
All right, so we're back to this again. So that's it. I mean, you get the picture. Hank just now keeps saying the same things over and over again, trying to make the argument that they were drunk, that Karen Read has a pattern of needing to get the last word, which of course is a complete misinterpretation of what is happening there in their relationship, that the relationship was over and that she was, angry enough to back the car up for 84 feet at 24 miles per hour to run him over and then leave him for dead, and saying, oh, he could have been saved if she had just attended to him, which, of course, we know from Dr. La Posada, as soon as he hit, went backwards and fell, however he fell, whatever induced that fall, he was dead almost immediately. So, are there lots of questions left? You bet there are lots of questions that we have to continue to dig into. But it is very, very clear. It has never been more clear from Hank Brennan's closing argument that the Commonwealth was so off base in their understanding of what happened here. I mean, one thing I can tell you with 100% certainty, the Commonwealth's version of events is not what happened, right? 100%. No way. This is not what happened. And it's very sad. It's very sad that, unfortunately, the O'Keefe family is never going to see justice as long as Michael Morrissey's office remains in charge, because no one is going to investigate what really happened here. No one is going to dig deep into the people at 34 Fairview. Wouldn't it be great if we could see the full investigation, the full feds, the full array of whatever the feds dug up? But barring something like a federal investigation, there's just not going to be any charges here, and that's the real tragedy. So, it is what it is. It is what it is. Okay, that is it for me, everybody. Thank you so much for your time, your effort, and your energy, and I will see you again very soon.
God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in the cradles, profanities. I see the world through ice covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep. I love everything.